In this video, we will discuss stress in the workplace. What are the common causes of stress in the workplace and then how to manage that stress. Work is a very important part of our lives. We earn our bread and butter through our work. But it is more than that. It also gives us a sense of meaning. It provides us a sense of fulfillment. So we are often highly invested in our work. So it is no wonder then that it can also be a major source of the stress that we are experiencing in our lives. So what are some of the most common causes of stress in the workplace context? Let's start there. When it comes to analyzing the causes of stress in the workplace, the literature typically describes them as occupational stressors. So these are the factors in the workplace that cause us to feel stressed. They can be classified into these subcategories: factors relevant to the organization, certain individual stressors, um, work environment stressors, and even certain biological factors pertaining to the work environment. We will go through each of these categories in detail. But before we go there, I must go back to this diagram that I always um, emphasize in my class. We should never assume that the demands that are placed on us or the problems that we are having, be they problems in our personal lives or in this case, workplace problems, or the demands that are placed on us by our boss, we should never assume that they are automatically the cause of our stress. Because the same demand that my boss is placing on me, which is causing me to feel highly stressed, may not cause any stress at all in one of my colleagues. So it's not the demand or not the problem that is causing my stress. I am stressed because I have a lower capacity to deal with this is the level at which the demand is, but my capacity is low. So because of this mismatch, I am feeling stressed. Whereas my colleague, he may be having much higher capacity to deal with that same challenge, so he is not feeling stressed. So we should not again automatically assume that it is the that these stressors automatically cause us immense stress. But there is value in finding out what some of these common stressors are, and that's what we will go through now. So we will start our discussion on various organizational stressors. And in that category, the most common stressor that is described is the lack of financial rewards. We all want money, right? Because money fulfills our various needs. If I discuss that in context of the Maslow's hierarchy of needs, which you should be familiar with, money fulfills our basic needs. It does fulfill our physiological and safety needs. For example, we would be able to purchase our food, drinks, and it helps us have a roof over our head. So it even fulfills some of our safety needs. Uh, but money not only fulfills these relatively basic needs, it can fulfill even higher order needs. When I am paid well by my employer, I feel like I'm being valued by my employer. So in some ways, it can indirectly also fulfill my belongingness needs. But even my esteem needs can be fulfilled by money. I may feel good about myself that I am earning so much money. So it can give me a sense of pride. So money can fulfill even higher order needs like self-esteem needs. Given that money fulfills our needs at many of these levels, it is then important to realize that the lack of money or the lack of sufficient amount of financial rewards can be frustrating, can be a cause of difficulties in our lives. So that is the reason it becomes one of the most common organizational stressors that is described in the literature. When it comes to money, though, we should not automatically assume that it is the absolute amount of money or the lack thereof that causes us to feel stressed. That can be the case. So if we are not getting sufficient amount of financial rewards and we have higher amounts of needs, I have 6 kids to feed and I'm getting only money that is enough to feed 2 kids, then obviously I will be stressed. So absolute amount of money can be a contributor to stress. But oftentimes, money is also a cause of stress in relative terms. So, how much am I earning versus how much is somebody else earning? My friends, my colleagues, how much are they earning? And this is explained well in equity theory, which again you should be familiar with. So, when we are talking about money as a reward, we are referring to outcomes. So, the amount of money that I am getting as rewards. I compare that with the rewards that others are getting. Okay, uh, but we do not just compare rewards or financial rewards that others are getting. Now, we compare it with the amount of effort that we are putting in. So yes, I am, let's say, earning $100 per day. Uh, but how many hours of work am I putting in? What are my qualifications? And so on and so forth. And I compare that with my colleagues' outcome in form of money and the amount of effort that that person is putting in. If there is a mismatch in this ratio, then we can feel that we are being unfairly treated and then experience unhappiness, frustration, stress. And this is something that has been observed in animals as well. Here's an example um, that was experiments done on dogs. This was done at the University of Vienna. So they take pairs of dogs. The researcher goes and asks the first dog to extend its paw, and the dog happily extends its paw, and then the researcher moves to the second dog and asks the second dog for its paw. The second dog, as well, the friendly creatures that they are, extends its paw. But the researcher gives the second dog a treat for having extended its paw. The researcher did not give a treat to the first dog. Now, when the researcher comes back to the first dog and asks for the dog's paw, now the dog is mad. The dog isn't even looking at the researcher for extending its paw. So they all did the same inputs. Both the dogs did the same inputs, which is that of extending paw, but they got different outcomes. One dog got rewarded, whereas the other wasn't. That is the reason the dog that was not get rewarded was unhappy, stressed, frustrated. So this is another aspect that we need to take into account anytime that we are talking about rewards. And it can be any form of rewards. It doesn't necessarily have to be financial rewards. It could be rewards in form of promotion. It could be rewards in form of any valued outcome that we get from the workplace. And I have a video link, the YouTube link that you can use to watch a really funny video about how similar kind of experiments have been done on monkeys. Um, Now, here are some other organizational stressors. We have already discussed lack of financial rewards, but the second one, lack of career guidance, that can also be a cause of stress. Why? Because we do not work only to earn money. That is definitely one of the reasons why we work, but we also seek growth at our workplace. So we would like to have guidance on how we can grow in our profession. So we all have personal goals. If I express it in form of the expectancy theory of motivation. By the way, I won't go into too much of detail about the expectancy theory here, but I have a video on the expectancy theory that you can watch. So, and you may remember the expectancy theory from some of your other classes that you would have taken. So we aspire for many things at the workplace. Um, so when we get career guidance from our manager, from our bosses, the, the person provides clarity with respect to how with our effort, we can achieve the necessary performance targets and then ultimately get the rewards that we can get from the organization, which would then finally help achieve our personal goals. And those personal goals could be I wanting to be the CEO. So I may be getting a good amount of money right now. But if I am not having clarity with respect to how I can progress further in my job, and if that is something that is important to me, then I will be frustrated, I will be stressed. Now, let's talk about overspecialization, how that can cause us to feel frustrated and stressed. Overspecialization typically should be good, right? Because we are bringing in more competency to the workplace. How can that be a cause of stress? Well, it is easy if we think about it in context of the diagram that I always go back to. Uh, when you are over specialized in anything, one of the things it means is that you have much higher capacity, which is very good compared to the challenge that you are having at the workplace. But if there is a mismatch, well, you may not be stressed in the traditional sense that you are feeling overwhelmed and you are not being able to meet the challenges, but you will be bored if your capacity is super high, whereas if your capacity is super high here, whereas the challenge is small, you will be bored, and that is also unpleasant. Both boredom as well as being overwhelmed with the demands, which is typically how we describe stress, both are unpleasant, frustrating, right? Ideally, what we want is to be in the zone, or what we call as flow. So from that perspective, even overspecialization can be a cause of stress. But overspecialization can be a cause of stress from another perspective as well. The equity theory, which I just discussed, that can also explain how overspecialization can cause stress. What does overspecialization mean? I bring in a lot to the table. So my inputs in terms of qualifications, in terms of ability, in terms of skills is super high. Okay. Whereas the outcomes that I'm getting, the rewards that I'm getting are still the same. They are not commensurate with the skills and the specialization that I bring to the job. So naturally, my outcome input ratio is going to be lower than what others are getting. They are not as specialized, but they're still getting the same outcome, same rewards. Whereas I'm getting same rewards for despite having much higher level of skills. So then that can cause me to feel frustrated. That can cause me to feel like I'm not being treated fairly. So that's how overspecialization can also be a cause of stress. Now let's go through some of the other organizational stresses. We will go through workload, hours worked, time urgency, job complexity, all of them together. For that matter, even unrealistic time constraints, unreasonable workloads, because they all follow the same mechanism through which they cause us to feel stressed. And that goes back to the chart that I always use in context of stress. What happens when we have too much of work, when there is an overload of work? What happens when we have to work too many hours? Or when there is a time urgency? There is a demand that I need to finish this project within 5 days, whereas it actually needs 10 days. What happens when the job is extremely complex? That I have to process too much of information. I need a lot of skills to be able to accomplish that job. Or when, again, same thing, when there are unreasonable demands in form of workload or time constraints. They all are placing more demands on me. So the demands are high in all these examples. Now, those demands will not cause me stress if I have the capacity to deal with. So if my capacity is way high here and the demands are here, I will not be stressed, right? But often organizations may put much higher demands on us than the capacity that we have to deal with those challenges. So if our capacity is here and the demands that are placed on us are here, so obviously we fall into the stress zone and we will be stressed. And organizations, because they want to maximize their profits, because they want to maximize productivity, they do place a lot of demands on us. And that is why it becomes one of the common causes of uh, our stress. And many times it may not be possible for us to have enhanced capacity, right? Especially with respect to hours. We all have 24 hours a day. We cannot increase that to 30 hours. So we have that is limited constraint. So if there is an expectation from you that you work 12 hours per day, every day, uh, well, you may have other responsibilities as well. You may have other family responsibilities. You may have um, responsibilities towards the community. You may have certain other needs. So, social needs and relaxation needs. So, if you have to work 12, 14 hours per day, and on a consistent basis for long periods of time, it can be a cause of stress because we will not have that capacity on a consistent basis over a long period of time to meet that level of demand. And in short bursts, yes, we can all work for 16 hours, for that matter, probably even 18 hours, right? Some of you may have let's say before an exam, you may work really hard. In short bursts, we can do that, but we will lose that capacity if we continue to do that over long periods of time. So our capacity will be lower than what the demand is, and that's what ultimately causes us to feel stressed. Couple other points. Uneven treatment of workers by managers. I have already discussed this in context of equity theory, right? It is not just the absolute value of rewards that we get. Here we talked in context of financial rewards, but any kind of treatment, it needs to be fairly distributed. So if it is not fairly distributed, uh, promotions or so it needs to be commensurate with respect to my effort. Then I will be stressed. So this is a case of fairness. We can talk about fairness in a little bit more detail. Yes, we will do that. But lack of control, and that is also, again, the same point about mismatch between demands and capacity. When we lack control, we have essentially lower capacity, right? We do not have a say in how the work needs to be done or when it needs to be done. So we are lacking control. So that essentially means lowered capacity. Um, we are not given the authority to take certain decisions, for instance, but we are responsible for the job to get done. So that essentially means we have lowered capacity. By, by placing these constraints upon us, our capacity is being reduced. But of course, the demands still remain. So that's how that causes us to feel stressed. The decision making point, I want to go through it in a little bit more detail. So I will explain that in the next slide. Now, just because the importance of the decisions, the complexity of the decisions, the responsibility, individual responsibility that we may have for the decisions enhance the stress that we experience during taking decisions does not mean that we should avoid these things. That does not automatically mean that. Why? Because these things can give a sense of deep satisfaction when we are responsible for people, when we are dealing with complex problems, and we have to take decisions about it. These things can also give us a sense of deep satisfaction, especially if we have relatively higher capacity to deal with these challenges. And this is explained well in the job characteristics model that was proposed by Hackman and Oldham, one of the famous motivation theories that talks about intrinsic motivation. Again, I won't go into the details of this theory because it is expected that you have learned it in your basic psychology classes or basic leadership classes. But you see, a skill variety, the jobs that require you to have a variety of skills as opposed to just one skill, that provides greater sense of meaning to the work, right? If your job doesn't require a variety of skills, it becomes easier, simpler, but that can also make you bored, which actually happened in my case, the example that I shared with you in the previous video in terms of personality traits and its effect on stress. Because I am high on openness. Uh, I seek out intellectual pursuits. I seek out creative pursuits, and one of my jobs didn't involve that. It was very restrictive, previous jobs, and that's the reason I was unhappy. I was dissatisfied. I was getting into the bored, unchallenged zone. So that would be then frustrating, right? So task identity, similarly, it's all about the importance in a way, because you are now responsible for the entire product, not just part of the product, where you can easily uh, not feel responsible if a product fails, because you are just responsible for one small part. But if you are responsible for the entire product, that higher task identity makes you feel more meaningful about your job. So the point is, one should not automatically avoid these things just because they can contribute to higher stress. In the job characteristics model, autonomy, though, is related to, so that is more in consonance with the stress literature in context of decision making. The greater autonomy that we have access to more information. Um, we are being given the authority to take those decisions, which then both increase the intrinsic motivation as well as reduce stress. So there are certain things that overlap, but other things that don't. So that is the reason we should not automatically avoid those dimensions that are associated with decision-making stress. But we should definitely be aware of them. That way we can manage those dimensions better. Now let's talk about individual stressors. Although the distinction between organizational stressors and individual stressors can be a little arbitrary, there is a lot of overlap there. But individual stressors have been studied extensively in the literature, examined really well, and they turn out to be some of the major contributors of stress in the workplace. So what are some of the common individual stressors? First one is being frustrated on the job, occupational frustration. And why would you get frustrated? One common reason is job ambiguity. What is that? When you are unclear about what it is that you're supposed to accomplish, when you are unclear about your responsibilities, when you are unclear about what procedures you have to follow to accomplish the goal that you are expected to achieve. In other words, you may have clarity about the goal that you are supposed to accomplish, but there is no clarity about the procedures you need to follow to accomplish that goal. When there is lack of clarity regarding what your boss expects from you, or when your boss doesn't give you feedback, timely feedback and high quality feedback. Feedback is really important because it tells you how well you are doing on the job. Are you progressing, right? So when these things are lacking on your job, you feel stressed. And you can understand this is related to the expectancy theory of motivation that I briefly touched upon in one of the previous slides. And that is a separate video that I have on expectancy theory. So do watch that as well. Because Expectancy theory is a very important theory, and it ties up with these individual stressors really well. So all of us have personal goals that we want to achieve. We all want to succeed in our lives, but we get demotivated when we do not have clarity with respect to how we can achieve those personal goals. So expectancy theory explains that really well. So clarity about goals, clarity about how we can achieve those goals, which would be expectancy, clarity about how the achievement of those performance goals can lead us to rewards, that is instrumentality. So all this clarity that only the boss can provide uh, will enhance uh, our motivation and reduce our stress. And this is explained well in the path goal theory of leadership as well. In the path goal theory of leadership, the leader's responsibility is seen to remove obstacles out of the way that reduce subordinates' motivation. So subordinates typically are automatically motivated to work towards achievement of their personal goals, whatever their personal goals are. Personal goals could be, getting the job of a or getting promoted to the job of senior manager or CEO, or personal goal could be having wealth of uh, 200,000, $300,000, whatever. So we are motivated to work towards our personal goals, but when there is lack of clarity about these things, how we can go about achieving that, that makes us frustrated. So those are the obstacles. The lack of clarity becomes the obstacle, and the manager's job is to remove those obstacles. That's what the path goal theory of leadership discusses. And it goes into great detail about what specific leadership behaviors you will engage in, or you should engage in, to remove the different kinds of obstacles. But that's a different topic. Again, I have a separate video on that topic as well. What is role conflict? Your job may involve multiple responsibilities. For example, the job of a professor, which is my job. I again have multiple responsibilities. I have responsibility towards my students, uh, teaching them, providing them feedback, grading their work, but I have also responsibility that of a researcher, which is conducting research, publishing research. I have responsibility as a reviewer of research, so which involves reviewing the research work of other researchers, providing them feedback on their research so that they can improve their research. I have responsibility as a member of my department. As a member, I have responsibility of being on different committees, responsibilities towards the college. So all of us have multiple responsibilities, and sometimes, not always, but sometimes there can be conflict between these varied responsibilities. Conflict could happen in context of time, because we all have limited hours, right? Um, if lot of my time is taken away in teaching, I will not have enough time, for instance, to conduct my research or review other researchers' work. That's just an example, right? So constraints could come from time, but constraints could sometimes come that are not necessarily to do with time. Imagine you are a human resource manager. On one responsibility may be that you keep your employees in the organization happy, satisfied, you meet their needs. But you may have another responsibility, which is to fire people, especially the anyone who is not performing well. Sometimes even employees who are performing well. So then that's a role conflict now. Or we can say that it puts strain on you. It is sometimes described as role strain, because the same role has dramatically opposite responsibilities, uh, which then puts a lot of strain on you. So that's occupational frustration. Stifled communication. Again, this is pretty simple and straightforward. Communication matters, right? You get important information through communication channels. And apart from getting information, communication also helps us feel relevant, feel close uh, to people, right? So when communication channels are not functioning properly, we feel stressed. Discrimination is discrimination and communication are slightly related because there are certain form of discrimination that happens uh, in context of communication as well. I will talk about it in a bit in the next slide. But let's quickly go through bureaucracy. Uh, and now Max Weber, when he conceptualized the idea of bureaucracy, he thought that would be the perfect way of managing. But in reality, though, it turns out to be not a perfect way of managing people. Uh, Bureaucracy can create unnecessary steps in the way that you have to go through to accomplish an otherwise easy task. There can be a lot of red tape, as it is called, that bureaucracy creates. Something that easy decision. Let's say what copying machine we should purchase for the department. Our old copying machine is getting older. We need to replace it because it's not functioning now. So we need to purchase a new copying machine. Uh, as a manager, if you can just purchase the right copying machine, replace it, and that's job easily done. But some organizations may require that you get approval from uh, 5 different managers uh, before you can purchase the copying machine, right? So that red tapeism, that for a simple decision you have to get approval from 5 different people, that can be very frustrating, right? So that would cause you to feel stressed because you are not being able to get your job done, and you are just spending more time on these wasteful activities of getting approval from different people. That's just an example again, but that's an example of how organizations that become too bureaucratic can cause a lot of stress in people. Inactivity and boredom, I have touched upon it. And again, the diagram that I have about matching of demands and capacity, that explains that really well. So if we have high capacity, but we are not challenged enough, we will be bored, which is in a way a form of stress as well because it is not pleasant. I've already discussed that. Going back to the discrimination issue, um, we can explain that using the knowledge that comes from the organizational justice literature. And this is a huge body of literature because this is one of the most researched topics in my field of organizational behavior and leadership. So this is all about fairness, fairness perceptions. What do people perceive to be fair? What do they perceive to be unfair? So the first point is distributed justice. We as leaders, as managers, should be fair in the distribution of the rewards or fair in the distribution of punishments, right? This does not mean that everyone gets the same exact equal reward. No, it means that the rewards have to be in proportion to their productivity, outcome input ratio, which is something that we already touched upon in the equity theory. So it needs to be equitable distribution, not equal distribution. Then there is procedural justice, which is that we are consistent in the execution of the rules. So I should not have a different set of rules for one employee and another set of rules for another employee. That could lead then those people to feel that I'm being unfair, right? So consistency in implementation of rules, giving employees a voice in matters that has especially any kind of relevance to them, having a proper grievance mechanism, all those things come under what we call as procedural justice. When the manager does these things, people feel that they are being fairly treated. When the manager does not engage in these proper procedures, they feel that they are not being fairly treated, so or they are being discriminated. Then we have something called informational justice. So any decisions that the manager takes, especially important decisions that has relevance to the lives of or the working of the employees, the manager should be explaining that to them. The manager should explain the rationale behind why the decision was taken. So providing information about the decision, why that decision was made. That when you explain it, people feel that you are being fairly treated. When you don't explain things, you take a decision but you don't explain, you feel that you are not being fairly treated. The last one is interpersonal justice. This is also a very important form of fairness perception. This is about how you treat others as a manager. Do you treat everyone with the respect and dignity that they deserve? Everyone, irrespective of somebody being a poor performer or high performer, everyone needs to be respected and treated with dignity. The dignity as a human individual. We can reprimand somebody for poor performance, but we don't necessarily have to be abusive, right? So if I throw curse words at you and I'm extremely abusive, that is low interpersonal justice. So the nature of the interpersonal interaction that I'm having with you turns out to be something that is perceived as unfair. Now, interpersonal justice doesn't have to depend on comparison. I may be nasty to everyone, okay, and still, so I'm not being discriminatory, right? But still, I would be perceived as a unfair manager, unfair leader. So all these factors contribute to stress, especially if there is lack of justice in any of these categories that will contribute to employees feeling stressed. So that is what we were discussing. And of course, the leaders have a huge role to play to minimize the stress by being fair in everything, in distributed justice, in procedural justice, in informational justice, as well as interpersonal interactions. Now let's go through the environmental stressors. As I have mentioned before, the distinction between environmental stressors and organizational stressors, they can sometimes be arbitrary. But typically when we are referring to environmental stressors, we are referring to stressors that may be coming even outside the organization, right? For example, technological change. It need not be something that was initiated in the organization, right? Just that the technology has changed. If you are a software programmer and you have always worked on C++, that is what you are trained in. But now imagine that program has become defunct. It has become obsolete, and a newer program has come into play now, which means that places additional demands on you. You have to learn this new language, so it's putting extra demands on you. So that is essentially what is causing you to feel stressed. You feel you don't have the capacity to deal with that challenge yet. Well, once you have developed the capacity, you will not be stressed. But until the point that you have developed that capacity, you will be stressed. So change often causes us to feel stress because in the previous environment, prior to the change, we had become accustomed to deal with the challenges that came or the demands that came from that environment. But a change means that the demands have changed. We have a new set of demands. We may or may not have the capacity to deal with those new set of demands. If we have the capacity, then we will not be as stressed. But if we don't, then we will be feeling stressed. And that is the reason, it is not just technological change, even relocating to a new place. I don't know how I will be able to deal with the challenges there. So there's a lot of uncertainty involved there as well. So I may be anticipating some kind of challenges that I may feel unprepared for. That itself will cause me to feel stressed. Even pleasant or desirable things like promotion can then cause us stress, right? If I'm getting promoted to a new role, that also means that I will be having a different set of responsibilities, a new set of responsibilities that I may or may not be familiar with. I may or may not have the capacity to deal with it. So even desirable things, because of these reasons, can cause stress. And that happens also with respect to marriage and many other things, but that's a different context. So any major changes can cause stress. Violence, again, can cause stress. Any form of violence in the workplace that itself places demands on us because of which we feel stressed. But violence, we can also think of it as a form of interpersonal injustice, right? As I mentioned in the previous slide, that can cause anyone to feel stressed, irrespective of whether somebody is being nasty to everyone or just one person. Even if somebody is being nasty to everyone, one can still feel stressed because violence or being nasty, nasty is a relatively milder version of physical violence, for instance. But all of those things, they pose a threat to our either psychological self or a physical self. So naturally, we feel stressed by these factors. There is one more point that is discussed in your textbook under biological factors, though it is not strictly a biological factor, but it is called compassion fatigue. Now, everything has a biological basis, of course. We have discussed that in the biological basis of stress topic. But when we're talking about compassion fatigue, certain jobs involve that we be very compassionate towards the people whom we are caring for, like the job of a nurse or sometimes even an HR manager or a doctor. That can put a lot of strain where you always have to be taking care of people. If you are working at an elderly home, always having to take care of people, that can place a lot of strain on you, especially right now, for instance, with the COVID-19 outbreak. There are physicians and nurses who have died because of they themselves getting the infection, right? So while it is important for them to be compassionate towards the needs of these patients, it does place a lot of strain on them as well. Um, so these jobs can give a lot of meaning, personal meaning to yourself because you're making a difference in the world of, you're making a difference in the lives of people. But at the same time, it can place a lot of strain on you if you are expected to uh, um, be compassionate even in really difficult, trying conditions. So this is going to be my last slide for the topic of job stressors, the factors that cause us to feel stressed on the job. If I try to summarize everything that we discussed, these will be my two main points that you should keep in mind. First one is beware of any job that gives you high levels of responsibility but provides you with low levels of authority. What do I mean by that? Um, if there is a huge amount of expectation from you, you are given a lot of responsibilities. You are responsible for this, lot of, or things that have huge significance in people's lives. You are given a lot of responsibility. But along with that responsibility, you should be given the authority to take important decisions. If you aren't given that, then you will be feeling highly stressed. So demands, those things are good, but along with that, you should have that authority to be able to take important decisions. If not, you will be highly stressed. The second point that I would like to emphasize is job stress resides not in the actual job responsibilities, but in the perception of it, right? So, and I have mentioned this in different contexts, but the demands and even the capacity, these are all in context of perceptions, right? Uh, they are not necessarily always objective demands and objective capacity that we are talking about. Uh, the same demand could be perceived by somebody as too much, by somebody else not too much. Same with respect to the capacity. Uh, I may have high level of capacity, but believe that I don't have as much capacity. Or I may have low capacity, but I believe that I have higher capacity. So perceptions influence a lot of how much stress we will be experiencing. So if we can manage that, then we will be better off.